What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. We're just out on the Tongsheng TSDZ8 750 watt mid-drive motor. And so today, I've got it on the factory firmware. So probably like the last week or so, I've been experimenting with the open source firmware for the Tongsheng TSDZ8. And at this point, I think, unless I'm doing something wrong, I think that I've tested it enough to kind of get a pretty good understanding of what's going on with it and how it performs. So the factory firmware is just like the code and the software that comes on the motor when you get it from the factory. That's one we're using today. The open source firmware, that's something that you have to go through an arcane, obscure, nerd procedure to get onto your motor. And we're going to talk about it today while I'm riding around the factory firmware. We've reverted this back to the Tongsheng factory defaults. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the state of the TSDZ8 motor in 2025. So it's September 2025, and I think that there's a lot of misinformation on the internet regarding the TSDZ8. I think when this motor first came out, it had some issues, but now in 2025, a few years later, I think that the issues have been resolved, and the factory firmware that comes on the motors now works fairly well. And in my opinion, from what I've seen, we're going to test it further today just to be sure. But as far as I can tell, the factory firmware in terms of performance and just like the torque per amp and how powerful it feels with the factory firmware, it just seems there's something about this setup that seems more powerful and more torquey than the factory firmware. And I don't think that it has anything to do with like a software or like a configuration issue. When I was using the open source firmware, I maxed out the battery amps and I maxed out the max power watts. So the open source firmware should have been fully unlocked as far as I understand. And so I got the open source firmware doing like 21.5 or like 22 amps or something. So it's about 1,000 or like 1,100 watts, 1,150 watts or something on the factory firmware. But I can never really get it to do a whole lot more than that. And I was getting a lot of like errors with the open source firmware. So I put it back on the factory firmware because it just felt like the factory firmware under every circumstance just felt better, and it felt more powerful, it felt more torquey at every, like, not just like at slow speeds and also medium speeds and also the top speeds. Everything about the factory firmware just seems better. So I don't know, I might have, maybe there's some way to tweak the open source firmware so that it can do a little bit more power. Like, I don't know if there's some kind of a problem with my configuration. But so I'm going to look at my watt meter that I've got on the opposite side of this. And it says 25.21 amps peak. $1,366 watts peak. So it seems like the factory firmware on this thing with my 52 volt battery and the Samsung 40 T3 cells, so these are good cells. It's a 52 volt battery, but it's a very small battery. It's 14S2P, so it's only an 8 amp hour battery. But the motor feels really good on this battery. I mean, when you're on a full charge, even with this 2S battery, like I can get going above 30 miles an hour. And even in some circumstances, like if the wind gets behind you and there's not too much wind resistance on flat and your tires are inflated, like I've got it going like 34 miles an hour on flat, using the 52 volt battery, and I guess it's like 25 amps or something, slightly over 25 amps, so that could have something to do with it. Hey there.
You all good?
Yeah. Thanks, brother. So yeah, we're just gonna take this out, take it for a rip, see how it goes. So it does seem like the factory firmware is doing a little bit more than I thought it was, because when I go online and I look at the TSDZ8 kits that you can buy right now, it seems like they're marketed as like 21 or 22 amps, but it seems like mine's doing like a little bit over 25. Let's see here, double check. Yeah, 25.21 amps. So this one is set to do like 25 amps. That's pretty interesting. So we're gonna take this thing out for a ride. I am gonna disconnect it from the 52 volt battery at this point though. All right, so let's make sure that the watt meter, oh, the watt meter didn't even reset. We gotta disconnect it and leave it disconnected for a second. So when I was using the open source firmware, it felt like even when I turned the power all the way up, and I had it set to 26 amps or like 28 amps and like 1500 watts, like I tried to max it out. I think there might be a limit in the open source firmware that limits it to 23, even if you type something higher in. So that might have something to do with it. But I still think that just fundamentally the difference was more than like a few amps. The motor, when I'm using the factory firmware, the motor seems louder. Like it seems like it makes more of like a whistling noise, and like the motor is just spinning faster. It reminds me of, I think it's something to do with just like the motor control and like the field weakening and the FOC. Because the manufacturer, they know the exact electrical characteristics of the motor so that they can optimize their firmware so that the FOC runs really efficiently and gets maximum torque per amp, and then they can optimize the field weakening so that it'll have a good top speed. I think overall, right now, I mean, unless there's some way, it seems like right now the open source firmware is limited to 23 amps, but I still think that just fundamentally, even if you made a change to the open source firmware code and made it do a few more amps, there's still something else going on, and it's a day and night difference. Like when this thing is on Pelosis 5 out here right now, like it is just like a billy goat. Day and night difference. It seems like each gear, like I can get going faster in each gear, so it's just better field weakening. The motor's spinning faster. And after riding the open source firmware for a few days, like I usually put my hand on the motor at certain spots while I'm riding. And it was getting hotter on the open source firmware. And there's not really that big of a difference in the ambient temperature or anything. The weather has been pretty consistent lately. Because when I first got this motor, everybody was saying that it was loud, and I'm kind of like, I agree with that. It's pretty loud. It seems like it's louder than the BBS02. To me, the TSDZ8, it's like a BBS02, but they learned some lessons from the BBS HD and then put it into the TSDZ8, like that IPM rotor. I think that the TSDZ8 is better than the BBS02 just because of the rotor. Because the IPM rotor, you can do more field weakening with it, and it can handle a little bit more than that goofy BBS02 rotor where the magnets are just glued onto the outside of it and they come flying off. After I put the TSDZ8 back on this factory firmware, I have a new appreciation for how good it performs. I mean, it just makes it feel effortless. And when I first tried the pedal assist out on this thing, it felt like there's some kind of a delay with it. But I've kind of got used to it. I don't know. I wish that I could play around with the configuration of the factory settings just slightly. Man, whoa, 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 it's just like, this is taking off right there, bud. That's crazy. That's awesome. Yeah, I think I'm going to be sticking on the factory firmware for now. It's working really good. I think Tongsheng knows what they're doing. I think that Tongsheng could totally dominate CYC if they would let you configure just a few things about this motor, because that CYC, I don't trust CYC at all. I mean, give me the name of a YouTube channel that has had a CYC motor last for more than a year that they ride regularly. I don't think you can. So I don't know. I'm probably not buying the CYC Photon Gen 2. There's no way I'm paying for that thing. So I guess my creak is still creaking, or I guess my rear shock is still creaking from yesterday. I hope that gets out of there, because it sounds pretty bad. We gotta hit some jumps and knock it loose. I sent Tongsheng an email. I hope they see it. Oh! Man, that part always scares me. Something I've noticed about the factory firmware is that when you're in the wrong gear on the bike's gears, like, it can still go really good and it doesn't feel like you're bogging out. But with the factory firmware, it was like if I wasn't in the wrong gear, or if I wasn't in the right gear on that open source firmware, it just felt like it was totally bogging. So So it's my opinion at this point that the factory firmware is probably the way to go. I can live with it, and it just feels way better. I think Tongsheng's using some pretty aggressive field weakening because it reminds me of when you put the BBS HD on high voltage and then give it field weakening. It sounds like it's really spinning the rotor. It seems like with the factory firmware, when your pedal cadence gets faster, when you're spinning the cranks faster and it's easier for the motor to spin, it kicks in the field weakening so that the motor can get more RPMs and get more speed out of each gear. Because when you're first starting out, it just sounds like it's kind of like humming and kind of spinning, but then when it really gets going, like you can hear it. It's like whistling almost. And that's the rotor. Inside of the motor spinning, that little blue gear very fast. I still haven't opened this motor up. I think I'm going to open it up one of these days because I want to see if any of the little signal wires got like smushed or something when they were closing when they screwed on the controller to the motor, because I've had kind of like some sporadic random issues with this motor, but on the factory firmware and on the open source firmware, so I don't know. Maybe there's some wires. I saw a picture online where somebody's Tongsheng TSDZ8, when they screwed the controller on to the motor, there were like some wires pinched by the metal casing of the motor. And the wires were like shorting together intermittently, and that could cause a lot of problems for the controller. If you have like two wires that are randomly like shorting together when everything is vibrating on your bike. I have a bug. Oh, he's on the outside of my goggles. Get off of there. Yeah, so right here, this is a little bit of a climb, and there's like some chunky rocks and stuff. And with the factory firmware, it has always just dominated this. When I put it on pedal assist 5, like it just rips up that. And And that's what I would expect this motor to feel like when you're on full power in a low gear on your bike climbing. When I was on the open source firmware, it felt like the motor was maybe doing like half of the work. Like even when I was pedaling as hard as I could, hitting the throttle, trying the throttle, my torque sensor is calibrated as far as I can tell. So I don't know. It is my opinion at this point in time that the factory firmware is the way to go, and there's a lot of misinformation on the internet, and I respect and appreciate the developer of the open source firmware. But at the end of the day, I think that Tongsheng designed and manufactured the motor, so they probably know best how to make it go, you know? And it would take some, it seems like it would take some significant work to get it performing as smoothly and as powerfully and efficiently and match the performance with open source firmware. Like, it would probably take some work. And so maybe in the past, the Tongsheng factory firmware wasn't any good and the pedal assist levels were all goofed up and whatever, but that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. It seems like they've mostly sorted it out at this point. Watch out, bunny. Oh. Because to me it just feels night and day. Like there's something different than just 100 watts or a couple amps or something, like, definitely, without a doubt. I'm gonna say that there is something about the TSDZ8 that seems better than the BBS02. I would say that the TSDZ8 is definitely better than the BBS02, just because it has that IPM rotor. It's probably more tolerant to overheating, and it does seem like Tongsheng has implemented a pretty sophisticated motor control implementation, because it's got to be doing some field weakening. It feels better than a BBS02 for sure. Because I think Bafang rates the BBS02 as 120 Newton meters of torque, I think. I don't know. And then Tongsheng says this is 140. And some people have doubted that claim. I think maybe at the beginning when Tongsheng put the TSDZ8 out, maybe it wasn't doing 140 Newton meters, but I would say at this point, I haven't used my BBS02 for a while, but I think this feels better than the BBS02. I think the BBS02 was fairly loud as well. I thought it was louder than the BBS HD. I think the TSDZ8 with the factory firmware and doing all the field weakening or whatever it's doing, like, it does seem like the TSDZ8 is slightly louder than the O2 maybe. Might even be louder than the BBS HD a little bit. So I put a different Zoom X-Tech HB100 brake on the rear today because my other one needs a new pad and a bleed or something. What's up, butterfly? Holy. This, I think the pads on my other caliper were getting worn out, but I want to see if it was just the caliper, so I just popped a different Zoom X-Tech HB100 on there, and this one works fine. I'm gonna have to bleed the other one. I've been told that they come with bad mineral oil inside of them. You gotta bleed them. Maybe put a different brake pad on them. I think we're gonna take a little, oh man, it seems like somebody put a stick on that shortcut to block it off. But sometimes I don't feel like doing this part of the route run. I just want to keep going. I was a fan of that shortcut sometimes. I'm kind of curious if what kind of current it's doing on here with the 48 volt battery. I wonder if it's the same or I remember when I'd put my BBS02 on 52 volts, you could always tell a pretty big difference. And I always liked the BBS02 a lot more on 52 volts. It always felt slow on 48. But something about the TSDZ8, it feels good even on 48. Oh. I think somehow the TSDZ8 factory firmware can like detect when you're in the wrong gear and it's hard for the motor to go, and it does something. It does like a booster or something, I don't know. But it feels like if I'm on the wrong gear with the TSDZ8, I can just kind of like push harder and get through it. My dropper isn't working currently, so just gonna send that. Oh! Plug in my helmet. See, we were just ripping around today. So, this is a lot more fun, IMO. I'm glad I'm not the only one that skips that rock garden there, because that thing is wacky. I've graduated to clearing the rock jump without getting bucked off anymore. Even with my dropper up, I've mastered it. I could maybe open my fork up a little bit. Slightly. So you guys will have to let me know in the comments. Can you tell the difference today compared to the last video? Just like how much faster we're going. And the motor just sounds louder, like it's just cranking better. I think it'll be interesting to see the CYC Gen 2 and how it performs. It's going to be hard to beat this, the TSDZ8, especially at this price. I think Tongsheng has almost got it to the point where you don't even need to configure it, and it just works pretty good. It's like 95% of the way there. It can still get quite warm, the motor. It can get pretty hot even on the factory firmware when you have it on full power. Mostly just when you're throttling down the street at max power. But I've rode this motor on days when it was like 100 degrees out. So I think it must have some kind of over temperature protection going on in it. whether it's an actual temperature sensor or I don't know if they have some, like sometimes with motors, the manufacturer will just kind of like use some kind of like an algorithm where they keep track of how much power the motor is using, and like you can kind of tell if your motor is a 750 watt motor and then somebody is doing more than 750 watts with it and you're measuring the power consumption, you can kind of approximate how hot the motor might be. And they probably designed the motor so that like if you're within the operating conditions, like that the operating temperatures that the manufacturer specifies, I think you could probably run the motor pretty hard for quite a while. And even if it doesn't have a temperature sensor, it might have some way of like protecting against high temperatures. I think the thing about the open source firmware that was the most important was it gave me a new appreciation for how good the factory firmware works. Because it works really good as long as you're not getting error codes. When I first got this motor, I was getting some error codes just like randomly. And it hasn't been happening as much. Like, I think the error codes, they might have different meanings in different circumstances. Like, I think it might have some kind of over temperature protection where it can kind of know that the motor is probably overheating, and then it'll kind of like just give you an error message for a minute to allow things to kind of cool down a little bit or something. I don't know. Because I've read that it doesn't have an actual temperature sensor, which is kind of interesting because I was almost certain that it did, based on, I've done some rides with this thing where it was like 100 degrees out and I just throttled it down the street and I thought that I would have broke it, but at some point it does seem like it starts to throttle or something. Or I don't know if the motor windings work in such a way where like when you get down to 48 volts, like the windings of the motor just kind of throttle the power or something, because it does kind of feel like when your battery gets half dead and you get down to 48 volts, this thing like slows down slightly in terms of like max speed and stuff. It's still pretty torquey when you're going slower, even when your battery's going dead, but like if you're going down the street with this thing and the battery's at 48 volts, you're usually going a little bit slower, and that was more pronounced with the open source firmware. When the battery would get to 48 volts on the open source firmware, I could barely get it going 25. But with the factory firmware, even when the battery's going dead, I'm pretty sure I can still get it going 25 to 30. Like it never seemed like the motor slowed down quite as much when I was using the factory firmware and the battery was going dead. So I think that just has something to do with the motor control. And I think the factory one kind of like adjusts dynamically. Alright, we're back on the move. Running the factory firmware is feeling good. We are flying around out here today. Air 18 on my factory firmware means that you're holding the brakes when you start the bike. I'll have to jot that down for future reference. I'm gonna have to ask Lee from Powallon for a little bit more details about the factory firmware and like how each of the pedal assist levels are intended to be used and stuff. So the last 2 rides I only made it that far because I was all worn out from pedaling the open source firmware, and I was frustrated from error codes with the open source firmware. Oh, wow. Okay, that's the part where there's a tree that fell down and I went flying right under it. Oh, wow. It does seem like perhaps you could crawl underneath that thing, but I think it would be more effective to just go around it, probably safer. Oh, there we go. So what is this? Oh, we got a stick caught up in the TSDZ8. So what is this? The rubber chicken? Yeah, you can kind of crawl around that thing, not a big deal. All right. We'll have to report it on the trail bot. It's not too bad. Oh! Oh! I gotta get that other hydraulic brake on the back of this thing. That front brake helps out a lot, having a good brake. On the streets, when you kind of know where like you need to slow down and stop most of the time, and you don't need a lot of modulation, something like those zoom brakes work pretty good, or even like an Avid BB7 mechanical brake can work pretty good for on the streets. But on the trails, I think it does help to have a good hydraulic brake where you can just hit it with one finger. But I've tried some hydraulic brakes like Shimano MT200s, and it kind of felt like it was on and off. But these ones, these SRAM, what are they, Guide T brakes, it feels like there's a lot of modulation to them, which is nice for the trail. And these brakes, these SRAM Guide T hydraulic brakes, are currently on sale. Jensen USA, $20 for the front one, pre-bled. It's got the lever and the hose and the caliper, $20. So if you have an e-bike and you're listening to this in September 2025, go on Jensen USA and buy some SRAM Guide T hydraulic brakes, because they're on a crazy 75% off sale. And for $20, one of these front brakes, you can just slap it on there. You don't have to bleed anything. Have a really powerful front brake with a lot of modulation, 4-piston. With my front brake, I want a lot of modulation. When I had MT200s in the front, they got me into trouble a few times. I also ordered a SRAM bleed kit. I think I'm gonna order just like 5 pairs of these brakes right now, and then I'll just be set forever. I also have the bleed kit coming. Oh, see, I was in the wrong gear right there, and it just like, the factory firmware just like powers through it somehow. It just engages boost mode. So hopefully this video dispels any misinformation or perhaps outdated information. Oh. I thought at some point my shock would stop creaking, but it hasn't. It's still very creaky and embarrassing out here today. It's all good. it feels like it still gives me pretty good assistance even when I have it on pedal assist 1. I don't even know if I've ever tried pedal assist 1 out here with this thing. Oh, like some kind of large creature in the woods. Scaring me. Man, it's almost like pedal assist 1 on the Tongsheng factory firmware. It feels like pedal assist 5 on that open source firmware. I don't know what's going on with that thing. Because even on pedal assist 1, like if I start pedaling hard, it seems like it gives me, I don't know, it feels pretty good. A lot of times when I'm out here, I only have like 2 or 3. Just because sometimes I'm not trying to race around, but it is pretty fun to turn it on to 5 and rip around with it. I want to see a TSDZ8 with this factory firmware on mode 5 compared to a CYC Photon Gen 2. I think the TSDZ8, I have a feeling it's more cost effective than the Photon, and the performance is probably very similar at like 1/3 of the price. So that's what team I'm on currently. I'm on team Tongsheng TSDZ8 factory team. It's okay, dear. I'm going this way, buddies. Over here. I always talk to the deer in a gentle voice. See, look at this. I'm just flying on this factory firmware today. I don't even usually use pedal assist 5 with the factory firmware, but I wanted to show you guys what it's capable of here. I just feel like I'm really getting around out here today. Like it's working really good. I like this. And so I was looking around online at the specs for the Tongsheng TSDZ8. And it seems like some of the specs say the gear ratio is like 37, and then some of the specs say that the gear ratio is 40 something. So I don't know if there's different versions of the TSDZ8 or what, or if they've changed it. But I might connect the TSDZ8 to a phase runner at some point, or like VESC, and then run the motor detection and see what kind of values it comes up with. and what it says about the motor windings. I also got a longer chain where I could put it on here and I could probably use my first gear, and which I've never even tried. But I don't know. It seems like my second gear works fine for climbing. We're curious about what the watt meter is saying here. Let's see. It says 3.7 amp hours, 157 watt hours, 24.73 amps peak. $12.53 watts peak. So I don't know what time it is here. Oh. Can't believe this bottle didn't fall out. Oh, I've got too much liquid in my stomach. Wow. That's the Tongsheng minefield right there. Oh. Let's see how the grumpy Grouse is doing today. Gotta get the goggles on. I also think my helmet is unstrapped. Ooh, I see a puddle down there. Oh, the corner of my eye. I wanted to try to hit that drop today, but we'll have to see. Oh. Oh, 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 oh. A little moist right there. Whoa, I'm still not used to that drop. I'm scared of it. It does seem like it's a couple feet of a drop there. It's kind of weird. It's this drop where you're coming around a corner So it's kind of like you gotta maintain speed going around the corner to, you kind of have to like take the corner a little bit wide, I guess, I don't know, so you can turn and do the drop. The drop is on the inside of the corner. It seems like it's just faster to go around the drop. But it's fun to do the drop. And I would like to conquer that at some point. Ooh. Oh, a little bit of a tree down there. Mark that in the memory banks for a trail report. Oh. Whoa. It's kind of weird how having better brakes can actually help you go faster, because you can more accurately slow down. And you don't need so many fingers on your brake lever. There must have been an owl right there. There was like this huge bird. And it flew away and I didn't hear a thing. Here's the unofficial secret e-bike builder campsite right here. This is where you gotta put the camp down. The tent right there. Just camp out. So let's see how we're doing here. Whoa. I think we're gonna keep moving. The trails are gonna be very busy tonight because it's hero dirt and it's 5 p.m. have that Magic Mary tire in the front, it feels like I can just really brake with it. That's never going to slip out easily. Magic Mary's weakness is wet logs. I don't remember that jump. It feels like they built that jump up a little bit. That was pretty cool. After a while, some of the jumps just turn into these mounds, and you just kind of roll over them because there's no lip on it. Ugh. See, when I don't use my front brake, I just end up going off the side. Hopefully the wild turkey's dry enough. Because this is the fun one. Oh! Felt the rear shock that time? Wow. Oh. Oh. These Ergon GP3 grips are awesome for mountain biking. I approve. Very ergonomic and comfortable. Looks like a tree fell down there or something. kind of like this bike just how it is. I would rather be riding it around. Where it feels like it's absolutely ripping, than pedaling around struggling with the open source firmware. I don't know. Something was funky about that. Oh, moist right there. Oof. Magic Mary was hanging on for dear life. Whoa! Have to be careful right there. Wow. It's kind of a loose sand, loose wet sand. This Shimano Q's is definitely an innovation. Oh. Alright, now we're cruising, bubs. We're out on the street. Look how fast we're going. Even though it's at 49 volts, we're going 35 miles an hour down a bit of a hill there. But it's just way faster. So, my opinion at this point in September 2025 is that the factory firmware from Tongsheng has been significantly improved, and the performance seems to blow away the TSDZ8 open source firmware. There's this car behind me that's scared to pass me here. Oh. I don't know, I might shift focus here, and instead of trying to get the open source firmware, I think instead of trying to like improve the open source firmware, I think Tongsheng has already done the monumental challenge of making their motor run as good as it possibly can. So I don't know, like I think it might be time to encourage Tongsheng to perhaps allow users to customize the system in some way. I mean, how hard can it be to set up a display that can show a few parameters, and then where you can change the parameters from the display, right? So I don't know. I'm gonna send Lee from Powallon a little bit of an email, and maybe he can send me like some documentation from Tongsheng or something. It'd be nice to have like a table for all of the error codes that there are. I think I have one of them, but I don't know, it didn't seem like, I don't know, I'll have to ask him again. But I'm gonna be communicating with Lee from Powallon, and then I sent Tongsheng an email too, but I don't know if they'll ever get back to me. Maybe everyone should send Tongsheng an email and tell them, make a request, make a suggestion that they allow a little bit of customization with the TSDZ8. I've only used 6.3 amp hours since we started on the trail. That's pretty crazy. It's a 20 amp hour battery, so that's only like it's less than a third of it. Probably about a third of the total usable charge, but I think Tongsheng has it figured out. Like when I put the factory firmware back on this thing, and then I put the watt meter on it for the first time and I started measuring it, I rode it for like a couple minutes outside in my yard, and it only said 900 watts peak with the factory firmware, but it felt like night and day. Like 900 watts with the factory firmware blows away 1100 watts with the open source firmware. So I respect the developers of the open source firmware, but it does seem like I'm just going to be using the factory firmware because Tongsheng has improved it significantly. So we're just going to go cruising down this hill again, just like we did yesterday. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next episode of the TSDZ8 series. Peace out, bubs. Later. So yesterday when I was coming right here, the motor couldn't even stay going 30 miles an hour right here. When the road got flat right there for a second. So, I mean, it's going 4 or 5 miles an hour faster on the factory firmware right there. Top speed. It's way better, night and day. Undisputable. That is my opinion. Thanks for watching. Alright guys, so we're getting back,
I plugged in the battery at the same point yesterday, and I went on an even longer ride today with the factory firmware. So today I went even further, and we're down to like 44 volts right now, but I can still easily get going 25 miles an hour on flat. Let's see here. I mean, it just feels, yeah, like we're still going here, even though the battery's going dead. Like, look at this. So, we're cruising, regardless of the voltage drop. So, I really do think there's just something fundamentally better about the Tongsheng factory firmware at this point. I have it on my highest gear, I'm just throttling it up a hill, and it's just absolutely cranking still. Even at 44 volts, we're going 30 up a hill. So, thanks for watching. Peace out. 1253 watts peak. I use 12 amp hours. 463 watt hours. 25.52 amps peak on 48 volts. 46.16 volts min. 1253. There it is.